Hello, friends. Welcome to a Friday night live stream, Friday night live stream, Mythical Astronomy of Ice and Fire here. We're here to respond to the criticism. And I've got a window open that's feeding back the sound of myself to me. Let's just fix that. There we go. That's much better. Let's not get a vortex started. Well, timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly. That's not what we're doing here. So, hey, friends, we are here to answer a very interesting question. And it's one that I think about a lot and I've touched on a few times. Is A Song of Ice and Fire amoral, or what you might call nihilistic? And we'll talk about what that means. We'll talk about sort of what morality means in the context of the story. We're going to talk theme a lot here today. And I say we, friends, because once again, I have reached down with my Kraken tentacle into the crowd of squishers and myth heads on the channel, and I have plucked out a wise person by the name of Austin Flowers. Everybody, welcome Austin to the YouTube channel.
Hello, hello. Thank you, everybody.
And the crowd goes wild.
Long-time listener, first-time caller, you know.
First-time caller, yeah. Well, you talked yourself onto the stream indirectly by being smart on Twitter. This all started from a thread that we're going to read in a second, launching a certain kind of critique at George. I particularly liked your responses, so it was pretty easy to be like, hey, man, you want to come on and talk more about this? We may even get into some Bible stuff. Some Bible stuff, guys. Of course, George R.R. Martin is, like me, a former Christian, was raised Christian. He was raised Catholic. I was more raised Protestant, but you know, a lot of obviously shared mythology there, more or less. So a couple of books are different, but mostly we have the same Bible story. So we're going to talk about, you know, the conversation about morality and goodness and hope. Grace, I guess, is what we're going to talk about. It's going to lead into some of those things, and Austin's got some gems for us. So I see the chat welcoming Austin to the stream. Thanks, guys. Of course, y'all know Mr. Flowers, also known as the Edge Knight, right?
Yeah, don't ask me to explain that one.
Okay, hopefully that's not like an edgelord thing. So, all right, cool. No, you're not much of a troll. I don't know how to change names. See, I don't know if I'd ever let that guy on my stream. That'd be crazy, right?
I appreciate everybody. It's a rainbow of opinion, really.
Oh, it's a big family of reasonable opinions. And then right outside of that, just outside of that circle is I don't know how to change names going, hey, guys, have you heard about Fagon?
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding. We love I don't know how to change names, of course. He is consistently banging that Fagon drum, though. So let's go ahead and start by reading this thread. I tried to make a funny screen cap. It was a screen crap. It was me looking at a bunch of tweets going, what the crap? And so we're going to read this Twitter thread here and just prepared to be, I don't know, mildly annoyed. Prepare to want to flip your table. Don't actually flip your table, though.
Yeah.
And I'll try not to use too obnoxious of a voice while I read this. Oh, who am I kidding? Okay, so he's definitely coming out swinging. Says, here is the objective, correct, and final word on George R.R. Martin and A Song of Ice and Fire. So, if in case you're asking, like, I don't usually take somebody's random tweet and then make a live stream about it. This is a guy with a lot of followers. He is an author. He's definitely trying to put his opinion out there in public. So I feel like it's pretty fair to respond to here. So he says, despite having some real skill as a writer, and actually I can screen share this for you guys. Let's do that. That'll be more fun. I got to pull it out. It's just as a separate window. As a writer, and actually I can screen share this. Oh, whoops. I've triggered a vortex.
It's definitely hard to imagine someone being objective.
Where's this coming from? Stop. Oh, whoops. Vortex alert. Hang on.
It's definitely hard to imagine someone being objective.
Where's this coming from? Okay. That's what happens when you have too many bloody windows. I can just turn this down for now. Okay. Sorry, guys. I have ADHD and I have 30 windows open and the sound is coming from somewhere and I don't know where. All right, here we go. Is it where? No, it's still not fixed. Here we go. I found it. I found it. I'm so sorry, guys. So sorry. Okay, I'm sharing my screen. I'm sharing the tweet thread. How's it feel to be up here in the big leagues, Austin?
Oh, you know, it's not nervy at all. I don't understand how you do this, but kudos to you for doing it for so long, man.
Yeah, most of the time it's pretty easy, and then when things go wrong, you just make jokes and hope for the best. So that's the strategy. And this is not even the right Twitter thread. Great. It is this one, isn't it? Yes, it is. Okay. I hope everyone's working up their rage. It's gonna make you so angry. It really is. Okay, here we go. Here we go. Ah, perfect. So again, despite having some real skill as a writer, George R. R. Martin's project is wicked, a failure, and ultimately to be scorned. Wow. Okay. For fiction writers, theme is the crown of the art. It is the moral argument of the work that arises from the harmonious arrangement of all parts. It's the very spirit of the story. That part is true. Yes, we can level technical criticisms at George. He's bloated, repetitive, struggles with consistent pacing. But these are minor details compared to the single great error of his fat and wicked hubris as it relates to his chosen themes. And we'll just assume that use of the word fat and bloated is entirely meant as a comment on the writing and not at all a personal shot against George. I'm just going to give him the benefit of the doubt there to sort of sidestep that. But obviously, it's a little uncomfortable. But again, giving him the benefit of the doubt that he's just talking about the prose here.
Hopefully.
So he says, George wants to prove Tolkien wrong. He wants the moral argument of his work to prove that the transcendent heroism and romance of Tolkien is not real, that heroes aren't heroic and villains are sympathetic, that good does not necessarily triumph or even exist. And you can see he shared this headline of George talking about arguing with Tolkien. And George does talk about arguing or having a discussion with Tolkien, but it doesn't necessarily mean what he's said in the tweet above. But we'll get to that. He says, this theme can be written. It's not even particularly new or bold, since much better authors have explored it in the past, and he names a bunch of authors here. And he says, the problem is that 1, George decided to write an epic fantasy novel, and 2, he took this theme too far. He chose a theme utterly incompatible with the structural demands of the genre. He's doing the skin-wearing thing that you hate. So you have a story which is very obviously set up along classical lines, the young man of hidden parentage who climbs to greatness to meet an incipient threat to the realm beyond mere politics. The necessary end state the setup demands for satisfaction is clear. John is a king, alive or dead. The realm is safe. The fun is in the unexpected movements toward that state. But that satisfying conclusion is the one thing George's chosen theme cannot allow. His theme demands meaningless deaths or dissolutions for his characters as winter overtakes Westeros. And nobody wants to read that, because what was the point? That would have happened anyway. So he was in a perfect dilemma. He literally could not finish writing the series. His evil project had failed. Or had it? And here he's highlighting that Dance came out 10 years ago, which of course it did. George solved his dilemma by giving you an even more cynical ending to A Song of Ice and Fire. He cashed out and let even hackier Hollywood types take the heat for finishing the story in some of the dumbest TV ever made. Well, at least we agree on that. It was a master stroke. I mean, the TV show was dumb, obviously. It was a master stroke, honestly. He found a way to punish and demoralize his readership even more, underscoring the theme of his project. Fuck you, LOL. I mentioned Tad Williams before. A Song of Ice and Fire is essentially a clone of Williams's earlier Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn does what A Song of Ice and Fire attempted in a way that isn't evil, and therefore completed and satisfying. I recommend it if you have the time and interest. And of course, we know MS&T is a huge influence on A Song of Ice and Fire. George is very candid about that, and we've talked about that with Gray Area. Shout out to the Gray Area channel, and she's got a whole playlist on Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, and A Song of Ice and Fire correlations. So definitely check that out. Let's see. Okay, so almost done with this thing here. When I say clone, I mean clone. It's borderline actionable. Well, not really, but the real interest is in the DNA. Both series critique the heroic model of Lord of the Rings by bringing the archetype into a more realistic and muddled world. I would say that is true. The difference and source of Williams' success and Martin's failure is that Williams shows how the heroic and romantic prevails despite, whereas Martin wants the hero to fail out of spite. This distinction makes all the difference. So he's basically saying, walk away from the books. He's not going to finish. Certainly not in a way that pays you off. Forget it. And let's see. Let's go ahead and stop there. Pick any of those tweets that you want to start with, Austin. I'm going to go grab Cleo. She's wanting to come and partake here. But yeah, pick any place you want to start with.
Right on. Cool. Yeah. I mean, just from the first tweet, it's hard to be objective about something that's not 100% complete. It's hard to say that the final word is your word ever, but yeah, as much as he was reading that, I was trying not to, so I'll bring it up too and read it. But this guy says that themes is important, and George's themes somehow undercut fundamental literature rules because they don't. He gives his characters meaningless deaths, which I found pretty weird, considering I can't think of a single death in the entire series that is actually meaningless, from which nothing like immediately or long-term happened. In fact, dealing with death and how people react to death and how they respond to death is one of the largest themes in the novel, sorry. And it's one of those instinctual feelings that I have that I don't think too hard about, alternative parentage theories, or if people are really, still alive as other people, because their deaths were important. Their deaths made them who they were. That is true objectivity, to see someone's entire life as it is complete. Then you can be objective. But while they're still alive and while they're still, I guess we're always growing, but while they're still going and making decisions, you can't really box them up at all. But George does give us boxes big time, like in people form. So, but going back to meaningless.
That's a great place to start with the meaning of death. And I see someone's already piping up, mentioning Quentin, and the three names that jumped to my mind were Ned's death, Quentin's death, and also Rhaegar's death. So these are all worth discussing here. Ned's death is one that a lot of people bring up. Like when that thread is like, oh, he punishes his characters, he punishes the heroes out of spite. You kind of feel like he might be talking about Ned. And people that take this angle on the story frequently mention Ned, because Ned is he makes mistakes, but he's a quintessentially good character. He's morally just. He's raising his kids the best he can. Obviously, he should have told Sansa a little more about how court politics works before engaging her to Joffrey. You can critique his strategy here and there, but this is a good character. He's the dad for the reader. In the beginning of the story, we're in the POV of like Bran and Jon, Sansa. Ned is their dad. Okay, so Ned feels like a good dad. He's either your dad or your friend's dad or something like that. Okay. And then he dies, and he dies most cruelly right at the high point of Game of Thrones. It's the death that gave Song of Ice and Fire the reputation for, anybody can die at any time. You don't know. And George has talked about how effective that is, that he wanted to set that tone. And the fact is, most of the heroes do have plot armor, with the exception that resurrections exist. So Jon's been killed, but we know he's going to get raised. So his story's not done. The other main characters, none of the other main characters have really gotten picked off. You know what I mean? Catelyn, I guess, was a main character before she died. But Ned's death, I always like to say, is very important because obviously in the structure of the story, he's doing a little bit of the thing where the mentor dies and gives room for the younger characters to grow and take their place. Like Obi-Wan's got to disappear for Luke to be able to become who he's going to become. But more specifically, it's Ned's example and the way that he raised his kids that continues to sort of echo out through the story. And also the example he set to his entire countrymen. Like in A Dance with Dragons, we still have the Northern Mountain clans banging on the table about getting, rescuing Ned's daughter in the middle of a snowstorm because he's been a just ruler. He's cared for his people in a way that he's engendered loyalty. But even more importantly, Jon, Sansa, Arya, these people are major players in the end of the story, and they were raised by Ned. So Ned's life has a lot of meaning because his ideals live on in his children. Would you agree?
Absolutely, yeah. I think it'll mean more to Jon, no matter who Jon's parents are in the end. It'll mean more to him that the time that Ned is his father figure. Knowing who it actually is isn't going to change that Ned is that person that was there teaching him, how to play catch morally.
So Ned's death certainly is not meaningless. It moves the story forward in quite a way, and he ends up being somewhat of a martyr figure, at least in the North. And you think about Quentin. Quentin, you had some interesting things to say about Quentin, and certain characters. Well, let's see. Let me just pull up what you had in your notes here. So we were talking about the self-sacrifice versus predator moral axis, and I've mentioned this a lot of times on the channel. I think one of the major themes of the story is definitely power and how people use power. That all the rulers in the story are critiqued very harshly. We're in the head of a lot of the rulers, like Cersei and Dany, Jon Snow, and all of the rulers are critiqued very harshly. And I've talked about the Azor Ahai myth as setting up this example of Azor Ahai, who's willing to kill people to gain power, or Nissa Nissa, who's willing to lay her own life down, like Jesus, and to save other people. And that the heroes of the story will be people who lay their own life on the line, and that the villains in the end are going to be more predatory in nature. So that's easy to see. But you made a point that some characters are essentially waiting to find their morality. They're sort of pushing it off to the future. And you named Quentin, Viserys, and Robert. So what were you talking about there?
Just that. So as far as like character trajectories go, if you're talking about, towards a good moral standing or towards a bad moral standing, and I mean, first off, it's really hard to find a basis for moral standing in the book. Even the old gods are like, they don't care about what you do to people as long as it's not in your own castle. They demand sacrifice. These are not moral gods. These are whatever, omnipotent, omniscient, vengeful Old Testament gods demanding things from the people in exchange for things for the people. This isn't.
It seems like most of the northern customs go back to actual magic, green seer power, and stuff like that. It's not based on morality, really. Yeah, I would agree with that.
And it's and you say that Ned is a moral character. Well, Ned, from a religious standpoint, Ned renounced his faith and then was beheaded. I think that's really powerful. Like, yeah, he wasn't supposed to die. Maybe it was a split-second decision by Joffrey to, really hit it home and be that, conceited jagoff he is. But in that moment, Ned said he renounced his own gods and got sacrificed, which is like, from a biblical standpoint, it's 100% what happened. I mean, we say that he's a good character and he's a moral character, but when it came down to his like spiritual beliefs. He wasn't there on what he'd sworn his life to. His, the old gods were so big in his religion, and he turned his back. And that's the best thing he could have done for his children. The only way he could live, the choice that we all would have taken, he took, and he died. Now, that Jesus doesn't make those decisions in the Bible. He doesn't take the easy way out. He stands on his faith. That's the whole reason. He at no point renounces his faith. Well, arguably there at the end he renounces a little bit, but yeah, he never changes his mind, and he's always about his thing. And Ned changed his mind for the better. That was the best decision. So it's a little
So this is definitely something that George does that I think is confused for nihilism, which is that just because you've done the right thing doesn't mean everything works out for you, but it may still be the right thing. So Ned may have made the right choice in the sense that like he's acting to save people's lives. And really you could even argue that conceding and saying that Joffrey is the monarch is an anti-war move, because if he's not saying that, he's essentially saying that we've got to revolt against the king. And you get into like, well, who's is it right? Are we concerned with certain candidates for king and whose right it is to sit on the chair? Or are we concerned with the welfare of the people, and going to war is not necessarily good for everyone, right?
Totally. And I'm sorry, I totally went off the rails from your question. Going back to your question, as far as moral trajectories go, each character has this chance to be vulnerable and question their own morality. Like the best example would be Jaime getting his hand cut off. He could have gone a really bad way with it, and he tried. I mean, he tries to die. He wishes he could be dead. Qyburn fixes him up, but he has thoughts where, he just wishes his pain was over no matter what. I don't think he consciously says I want to die, but it's there in the writing. You feel it.
Brienne talks about like, you're giving up. It's like, don't give up. So he's on the verge of, totally.
And he goes through that, like that catharsis. He's so down that he admits stuff to Brienne, and you realize this about his character, and he realizes it through the catharsis of saying it. He realizes, oh shit, I'm a good person. This hand, this is the hand that that killed a king, that pushed a boy out a window, and now it's gone. And by separating himself from that and allowing himself to be separate, so he has no choice in the matter. You'd think he has no choice, but he could go on a rampage with a stump. He doesn't. He chooses to embrace what his situation is, and he takes the hard road. He identifies with himself what that now means. And you can see it in his character. George isn't just saying, oh, Jaime makes slightly better decisions every time. We're in Jaime's head. We see that he's thinking about Brienne. He sees his thoughts about Cersei, that fear start to build. He talks about that look in her eye. And then he's more, sexually inclined towards Brienne. Everything about his character has changed its moral trajectory. It had a moment where it could change, and it did for the better. Now there's characters that they had their moment where they could have changed, like Cersei getting, stripped down, shaved, right. Stripped down, and she didn't decide to like take that and be okay. I can be a good ruler from here. And it doesn't appear accessible to the reader in the text. But when I read it, I didn't think Jaime was going to recover from getting the best swordsman in the kingdom gets his hand chopped off. He's not coming back from that. That's his job. That's his world. That's what do you do? And Cersei doesn't choose to start down that moral path of rebuilding herself. She goes off. She's now going to kill the faith, and down with the faith. And though that's echoed throughout characters, Viserys has his moment of downness when he's asked to walk behind the Khalasar. He's being dragged, and
Yeah, he's
that's his
got a few
moment.
chances. Yeah, and Danny gives him a couple of chances as well. Like
More than a couple, yeah.
she makes him the Dothraki clothes and intercedes with him to get him out of the cart. And yeah, no, he has a couple of chances and repeatedly sort of spits on it. Now, Quentin, how does this apply to Quentin?
He gets hit there. Who's he talking to? The Tattered Prince. He's talking to the Tattered Prince or somebody like that, or the pretty Maris or whatever.
No, yeah, well, it'd be both of them at the same time, I'd probably.
And they straight tell him, this is a dumb idea. You need to go home, or at least somewhere, and think about what you're doing. And he's like, no, this is a good sign. I'm going to go ahead and do this. Like he gets handed this, no, you shouldn't do this. This is really stupid. And he does it anyway. He doesn't take any time to examine the foundation on which his motivation is built.
So he's literally the fool tarot card stepping off the cliff without looking down. Yeah, totally.
Pretty much, yeah.
That's a good call. And George puts that story in there. I feel like it's so important. When he says life's not a song, that's Quentin's story. It's like, you don't, just because you believe you're the chosen one doesn't mean you are the chosen one. That just doesn't work like that. And furthermore, there's a lot to be said about father-son relationships. George is very interested in family legacy, the puppet strings, and all that stuff. So with Quentin and Doran, and we've hit this a couple of times here on the channel, but Doran is using his children still as pawns, and Quentin is essentially trying to make his dad proud, more than really anything else. So that
he's never
emotional. Like when you say the foundation of his reasoning for what he's doing, like there's too much of it that's just him trying to, well, I need to do it, and I need to live up to blah blah blah. He's not. If he didn't need to prove himself so much, he'd be more free to think strategically, modify his plans on the fly, build an alliance with Daenerys that isn't a marriage pact, which that path was open. So Cleo agrees.
He's never like thought about what his dad wants for him. The same way Arianne has that time to think about what Doran Martell wants from her. Quentin never takes that even to think about it. I mean, just Arianne was kind of.
You're right. You're right. That's a good comparison. Arianne ponders the strategy and the reasoning of it a lot, whereas Quentin doesn't. He's just like, I'm on this mission. I got to do it. I got to do it for Dad.
Right. And he never, and that leads him straight into, but think about it. If you were him and you're whatever, 15, 16, whatever Quentin is, he just wants to make his dad proud. He wants to go out and do the right thing. He's going to get a freaking dragon. He's going to ride it back or whatever he thinks is in his head. And it just, that he never, the best intentions, right? Best laid plans of mice and men, and he was a mouse in a microwave.
Touche. So far from a meaningless death, this is a death that informs us about Doran. It informs us about characters that are in similar position. I mean, he's like a failed chosen one, right? So you could compare his story to Jon's or Daenerys's pretty well. And then finally, I wanted to go ahead.
Oh no, I was gonna say you could compare Quentin's story to Jon or Daenerys. Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. Far from home, want to make the parents proud, want to live up to the expectations of everybody around you. Totally, definitely.
Yeah, and some of it really is about, I could just be projecting here, but George is an old hippie and a deadhead, and I think he's sort of, some of this comes down to instinct, using the Force, just feeling when it's your moment and when it's not. Daenerys, it was her moment to walk into the pyre and wake the dragons. There were a lot of signs that led her to that. Like you said, everything was pointing to Quentin, like, this is not your moment. This is not a good idea. And he's just charging in. So I think we all know that feeling of having a little voice in the back of our head that's like, this might not be smart. And you're just like, you know, it might, for a lot of us, it might be typing something where like when we probably shouldn't send it and we do, or you're in an argument and you're thinking about saying something you almost hold back, but then you dish it out and hurt somebody's feelings, you know? So
that's Tyrion in a nutshell.
Yeah, right, that is Tyrion in a nutshell. So Rhaegar is another one. I call him Dead Prince Charming because he is kind of Prince Charming. And if you look at him fighting against Robert, you know, Aerys was definitely a corrupt ruler. So it was easy to say, oh, well, toppling Aerys is just. But if you just look at the characters of Rhaegar and Robert, Rhaegar would have made a better king. I think that's pretty clear.
Much.
You know, so and Robert is kind of, you know, he's essentially a frat boy who got used as a pawn by Jon Arryn and Tywin Lannister and other people like that. So the wrong guy who came back from the Trident, as Cersei says, in some senses. And this is essentially the backdrop of A Song of Ice and Fire, is that Rhaegar is dead. So like you're saying, There's no real reason to go look for Rhaegar secretly alive because his death is really important. It frames the story. It shows us that it's treacherous to try to interpret prophecy and walk. He's another failed chosen one in a sense. He thought he was the chosen one. Then he thought it was his child. He was close to the mark both times, but not quite. And he's trying to read, you know, interpret the comet and all this stuff. And he's close, but close doesn't quite count. And he, you know, tragedy befell him. And so instead of getting to raise his three children as the three heads of the dragon over the course of 15 years, so they'd be all prepared to go to battle against the others, Rhaegar dies, his children are scattered to the wind, and they've each got to find their own way to this last battle and the knowledge that they need. So it's a much more interesting story, obviously, but it's set up by Rhaegar's death. So it has both narrative purpose and it also informs us on the treacherous road that Jon and Daenerys are walking. If you try and interpret the prophecy, you might end up like Rhaegar. And Dany compares herself to Rhaegar constantly, especially in her biggest moments, right? So
it's
definitely,
true, yeah.
Definitely a death that had meaning. It's not just because he hates good-looking dudes who play the harp. I don't think. I don't know. I mean, maybe.
Right. And it's strange how George plays with that too, because you know, like King Robert, when he dies, it means nothing to the character. He was essentially dead already, just fat and, you know, drunk and womanizer. He's like the guy that nobody wants at the party. He was already dead. And then he died. And I mean, symbolically dead. Like he wasn't doing much. He didn't take part in any of the affairs of the kingdom. He was just the dude up there on the throne. But when he died, the implications were massive. Like that's Ned's absolution right there. That's the only person that can be like, no, this is my friend. He's doing the right thing. He's right. You Lannisters out. Like, and that's gone. And the implications of this person that was just, you know, thematically, symbolically, you know, comatose for his entire reign as king, his death somehow means so much more. And you know, the same with what the death of Quentin probably means to Doran Martell. Like now it's war. Like, you know, the death has these implications across the text. And Rhaegar, it's interesting because everybody remembers a different Rhaegar. Like people love him, people hate him. Nobody is just okay with Rhaegar. Like nobody that saw him or heard him play, especially, wasn't in love or wanted to kill him. So that's what a neat objective viewpoint on a character. I mean,
he's the ultimate fight him or fuck him. Like if it's what people want, one of those two. Cleo comes to butt. It's a little too much climbing there.
But I was listening to that interview that George was talking about Tolkien. He was comparing himself to Tolkien, and I'm sure he's talked about Tolkien more times than this, but I was watching an interview in particular where he was saying, you know, that compassionate rulers suck. Like they suck as rulers. Compassionate men cannot be rulers. And Rhaegar sounds like a compassionate dude. So yeah, maybe, you know, King Robert, this warlike hero that just, you know, plopped it on the throne for 15 years, maybe he was a better king than compassionate Rhaegar. Who knows? Because he's dead. We can't tell what his policies were. What was Rhaegar's tax policy? We don't know. But he sounds like a lover guy, and that's not always the best when it comes to ruling a kingdom. Because people would have taken advantage of him. He would be too tempted to opt out of things. We'll get into that one later, but yeah.
Yeah, it definitely makes me think of Daenerys, because Daenerys seems like she might be developing the optimal mix of compassion and knowing what it's like to be downtrodden, while also having the steel and the wisdom, which is another sort of an underrated attribute of Dany, is that she usually sees through traps and deceptions, and it's pretty consistent. So yeah, it is hard to run that gauntlet. And even Daenerys ultimately is going to have to realize that sitting on the Iron Throne, I don't think is her destiny, but rather, she's been given the only weapon that we can use to hold off the others. So that's going to be what she's essentially the custodian of. But you see that tension in her Marinese arc, where she's trying to be compassionate, but also to rule. And she executes 163 of the slave masters, and then worries if it was the right thing. And if it was, I felt like an avenging dragon and they're slave lords, but was it really just, am I just as bad as other people? I have the dragons. Does that make me a monster too? So that self-reflection, I feel like, is important. It's one of the redeeming, characteristics, and one of the things you want to look for in a leader. But that's an interesting quote from George, because you feel like Ned gets in over his head, and you definitely call him a compassionate person.
Yeah. Yep.
But we do have Starks that are a little more harsh. Like who's that fellow that comes in at the end of A Dance with Dragons and sits on the throne for like a day and executes a whole bunch of traitors? That's which Stark is that?
I forget. I'm sorry.
One of the most famous ones
in history.
But I think there's going to be a similar moment at the end of A Song of Ice and Fire after the very end. But let's table that conversation. So this conversation with Tolkien, George has brought it up a few different times. First of all, George loves Tolkien. So when he talks about Cregan, thank you, yeah, Cregan Stark. So when George talks about arguing with Tolkien, it's arguing in the sense like a scholarly debate kind of a thing. He's interested in working with a lot of Tolkien's motifs, but asking certain questions or recasting certain things. And I often talk about George as dragging tropes down into the mud. It's not that he's not doing classic tropes. He's doing a ton of classic tropes. And this guy in the thread is pointing out that like John's story is a pretty classic trope. And Dany is in many ways just the female version of that, a lost heir, slightly different, a secret heir versus a disinherited heir, but it's pretty similar. George likes to take these tropes and basically ask the question, what would it really be like to be the chosen one? And he answers that question with characters like Rhaegar, Quentyn, Daenerys, Jon, even Theon, thinking that the comet makes it his moment and he invades Winterfell and ends up very much like Quentyn, sort of falling on his face. That is a good example of George pulling the tropes out into the mud. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to save the world or that you shouldn't try to do what's right. But he does want to ask the question of how does that actually go? And like I was saying earlier, just because Ned does the right thing doesn't mean he lives. Jon letting the wildlings through the wall is the right thing. Right. You can question how he rolled out the plan, okay? But it was the right thing to do, and he paid with his life, right?
Yep. Yeah. A lot of characters do that, and that's something that George. One of the main points that George said in that Tolkien thing was that bringing Gandalf back, he felt was somehow sullied the character, or somehow was a cheat code, a Deus ex machina from the author to bring Gandalf back. And George has plenty of resurrections and stuff like that too, but I think he he uses that finality as a way to be objective about king figures and father figures and hero roles. Like these people, on this hero's path, it's about the choices that they make, about the moral way to do things and the moral way to approach things. And George shows us again and again people who, sometimes there's unfortunate cases like what's his name, the Cassell, isn't no Cassell,
Jory or the older one,
Roderick, whoever was with Caitlyn until Ramsay got a hold of him.
Yeah,
I think that was Roderick. Yeah, poor guy, dude. He did the right thing almost at every turn. Like he even turned down Hornwood for whatever her advances, because he was still had a duty to do. And like that's the perfect character. And perfect characters make not even mistakes. Perfect characters have imperfect ends all the time. But that's not where George is going with his main characters. These imperfect ends they happen, but they're not. He's obviously trying to teach us a lesson to get us to question our own morals through the process of having his characters question their morals.
Yeah. So one of the fundamental issues of this critique is that Song of Ice and Fire doesn't. It's like the meaning of nihilist is like, let's go ahead and just pull it up. I mean, I feel like I could basically define it, but
yeah, I had to look too last night. I did. I was like, what is, I think I know.
The rejection of all religious and moral principles in the belief that life is meaningless. So it really is synonymous with amoral. And it just kind of means that, there's no karma, there's no right and wrong. It's just what men decide that laws are, that's right and wrong. So I would argue, so like, where would you start with arguing? Because neither one of us are going to be nihilists. So where would you start with arguing against that philosophy?
That George is nihilistic?
Or just like, we're even more basic. Why aren't you a nihilist?
Oh, why am I not a nihilist?
Yeah.
I mean, arguably I am. I'm not, agnostic or theistic. I'm not atheistic. I've just never, wondered about if there's a higher set of morals. I just do what feels right. What is wrong keeps you up at night. It makes you, wonder why you're doing what you're doing. When you're doing something wrong, you feel it in the pit of your stomach, whether that's a bad relationship or, you're.
So where does, I guess we're almost asking, like, where does your conscience come from? A religious person would say, well, God gives us an inherent sense of right and wrong. A humanist or an agnostic like myself might argue that it's inherent and fundamental to our nature.
It is, yeah. It's not some biblical paradigm that if you weren't brought up in Christian school, you didn't get. It's inherent in people to want to do what's good for their community. I mean, or for the people they love, I guess.
So the first place I would start with was sort of arguing against a nihilistic philosophy, just in general, would be the idea that basically almost every civilization has arrived at some version of the golden rule as the highest sort of morality, meaning how your actions affect others is the basis for deciding whether something is just or unjust, right? So like,
totally,
do what you will shall be the whole of the law is one way to say it. But it basically, the golden rule, of course, is, don't do something to someone else that you don't want done to you. So it has to do with, are your actions depriving somebody else of their, what we would call rights, but just their basic sort of existence. Yeah. So the fact that almost all cultures have arrived at some sort of version of that tells me that there is an abstract sense of right and wrong that most people seem to have intrinsically. Now, I guess you could argue that that's all cultural and that's all just parents teaching children to repeat that. But when you have different cultures finding their way to the same idea, then it feels like one of those universal truths of human existence that we just we find self-evidence, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I think any light you want to, or any metric you want to measure George's characters by, whether they're, you know, the INFJ or INFP or whatever they are, they fit into those really well because they are these, you know, well thought out characters with.
How'd you know I was an INFJ, dude? What's up with that?
I'm probably the same one. I don't know. It's I've seen it before, but I haven't taken the Myers-Briggs. That's what it is.
Mm-hmm,
Yeah,
that's it. Yeah, Myers-Briggs.
yeah. But you know, George doesn't. He doesn't put in themes of nothingness. There's no meaningless deaths. He he doesn't put in things without consequences in any way. It's just the way that it's written. We see the consequences of things without knowing what actually caused those. You know, take for instance, you know, what happened with Leanna. We see the consequences. Ned thinks about it all the time. We just don't know what he thinks about. We don't know what that promise was. We know it affected him huge. We don't know what it was. And because he does that in his, you know, in his writing, he puts these. One of the things I was saying was that the character's instinct is counter to the information that the character and the reader, well, that the reader knows. So like when
So
John,
in order to makes us wonder, why are they doing that? There's something we don't
yeah,
understand, right?
totally. Like when John sees Jamie and he's like, that's what a king should look like. And we're like, no, Jamie is a jerk. That is not what who a king is. A king doesn't push little boys out of windows and screw his sister and do all this stuff. But I guess a king can do that if he wants to, but that's not the perfect version of a king. We're reading it through John's eyes, and John's like, there's the perfect specimen. We're like, no, not really. But we're still faced with that information. That gives it that affects how we think of Jamie Lannister, of being this beautiful man. Like, I mean, he is a, you know, a good looking dude. He has to be. But we know more about him, and it offends even the character's intuition. So a lot of times George, you know, gives us something without giving us the other side of that idea in the book, without allowing his characters to really bridge the gap to the truth. He gives us the effect, and or you know, and not the cause. Like just like
Well,
the
it's a good
long night.
example of how he uses the unreliable narrator to draw you into the story, to make you work, to try to figure out what is, like, he always talks about the heart in conflict. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about these characters that have these desires that are sometimes pulling against what they think they should do or that think they need to do. You know, their various loyalties. We talked about Ned's sort of no-win choice that he had at the end of his life. John has a bunch of them too. And George does like to give us some of his characters no-win scenarios, because again, that's how life is. There's not always a clean choice. Sometimes you have to make a choice between two paths, and you know that each one has its own consequences, and that when you choose a path, you're choosing those consequences as well as the path itself.
It's a weird one to put your finger on, but there's something to it. Like before I lose it, Tyrion, when someone has a horrible disease, he then on top of that poisons them. Nurse or whatever, in, you know, at the end of Tyrion's, as they're getting closer and Nurse comes down with the sickness, Tyrion straight sees this guy in distress, and instead of doing anything for him, he poisons him. Tyrion is not a good character. He's not forming the good moral decisions that make, you know, he could have done anything. He could have helped the people around him. He smashes Marillion's fingers just because, like, he's not on a happy moral trajectory at all.
No, him and Jamie are both fairly amoral as characters go. But getting back to something that you were saying, this is one of the main points I wanted to make today. A Song of Ice and Fire is very much a story about consequences. Like, the consequences are what George likes to write about, whether it's magic, the consequences of using magic, or just the consequences of people's decisions. That's what moves the story. That's why George talks about the heart and conflict. He's saying the decisions of the characters is what moves the story. And when we say moves the story, we're saying the ripple effects of someone's actions. So in an amoral story, you wouldn't see so much emphasis placed on showing us what happens to people who make certain kinds of choices. Like it's borderline pedantic sometimes.
To pick on that, yeah.
You know, I mean, you could call Song of Ice and Fire like an anti-war story. Like he spends so much time showing us the Feast for Crows and the Broken Realm and all this stuff. I mean, it's a pretty stunning condemnation of war and violence, is it not?
Truly, his sense of irony with the situations that happen. It's almost perfect how his sense of like character irony of how these things occur and happen is perfect. He throws it in there to the point where people are predicting stuff far away because we know these characters so well, and we know that George he is not without a sense of irony, and like, I mean, that's why those themes are so perfect. It's hard to put your finger on any one theme about any of the that applies to anyone's situation.
So that's another thing I wanted to do, was to pick out some of the major themes of the story. I definitely don't. We've dealt with the idea that the theme is itself that there is no such thing as goodness or redemption. We sort of touched on redemption. We talked about Jamie. The very fact that there are redemption arcs in the story is kind of evidence that there is grace and goodness. Otherwise, totally. there would be no redemption for characters. But the major themes of the story, I mentioned power and the use and abuse of power. And we can extend that to violence and war because it's pretty much flowing out of that same thing. What other major themes have you noticed from the story? And I'm asking the chat as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think legacy. I noticed the other day how many people, how many times they think about the dead in Game of Thrones, the first book, is almost more than any other book. Like, they think about the dead. They just think about what the dead would have wanted.
You're right.
Like the in the crypts, they're so aware of what the Kings of Winter. Oh, they see me. Oh shoot! The whole book is just this this legacy trope, the theme going on. And then at the end of the book, they give us.
I mean, Ned and Robert go straight down to the crypts, right? As soon as they get there.
They don't even want to talk to the living. They want to talk to each other and then the dead. And even at the end of the book, the question is, what is Ned's legacy? And that's why the book ends where it does, because the overarching theme is what do we do when people die? And it's not even about people we love. It's about people in power, the systems that are upset just when one person dies, or like when Rhaegar died and everything just fell the hell apart, or Brandon Stark's or Rickard Stark's death, triggering this. Ned was locked in. He had to. That was the legacy he had to deal with. If the King of the North dies, or the Stark in Winterfell dies, the next guy has to avenge the last guy. That was his. I mean,
right. So that reminds me of the speech of Oberyn's paramour. What's her name? Not Elia, but different E name. Help me out. Ilaria. Thank you. Ilaria Sand talking about, okay, great. So you're going to kill Tywin's kids, and then they're going to kill our kids, and your kids will kill their kids, and it's just going to go forever. And we've seen the Blackwoods and Brackens. Like, yes, it will go forever if you want it to. So a lot of people are piping in with, similar versions of what you said, legacy, like generational cycles. Okay.
Definitely. Yeah.
And this ties into parenting specifically, because parenting is just the personalized version of these sorts of generational cycles. We also see it politically, though, as well. So it's just a difference in scale. Redemption and atonement. We mentioned redemption, but this is, again, not something you'd find in a story
Right.
that's nihilistic or amoral, that just wants to pound into your brain that like nobody wins and there's no goodness and all the rest. And here I want to make a very important point, which is that people do a sleight of hand with this critique. Like, on one sense, it's like, oh, George wants to say that there's no such thing as goodness and that people aren't perfect. And it's like, hold on, those are very different things, because people aren't perfect. There is no 100% good person, but that doesn't mean that there's no such thing as goodness. Goodness is a pole. It's an abstract idea, just like evil is. And we create these poles and we create a scale and we say things tend to be good or evil, maybe a little bit of both. So to say that the characters, George is arguing with Tolkien in the sense that there's no perfect characters. Even the heroes will have their flaws that they either have to overcome or maybe even that they don't overcome, and they're limping across the finish line wounded. Like, that's the shit that happens in real life. But that doesn't mean that there's no such thing as goodness or evil. So I'm amazed that disconnect you see in threads like this. It's like, well, hold on, sure, he's making sympathetic villains and heroes that we have to question, but that's not in order to say that there's no such thing as goodness. That's just a totally different idea.
Right. So. And it's from a social standpoint, and that's one of those things that George employs when he does, the fogs of history, the fog of history. We remember people not how they were, but how we've set them up to be in our heads. When we think of Arthur Dane as this perfect knight, we actually have no clue who Arthur Dane is at all. None. Zero testimonial from him, editorial, nothing. We just know that his statue looks good, and so he must look good. And George gives us those. Like, he says, oh, here's Arthur Dane, this perfect knight, or here's Azor Ahai, this perfect savior. And then, Azor Ahai, obviously, we know a little bit more about, but, when people say the Age of Heroes, and then, we associate that with Arthur Dane, the perfect knight, but then we have to force ourselves to ask the question, wait, Azor Ahai doesn't sound good. Arthur Dane, what was he thinking? Like,
Arthur Dane was an enabler of King Aerys. Like, we start to get, it's when Jaime remembers Gerald Hightower standing outside of the room where Aerys is basically raping Rhaella, and Jaime's like, don't we have to do something? She's part of the royal family. And he's like, oh, we don't protect her from him. And so, then you have Jaime's monologue about going away inside as Aerys was burning Brandon Stark, or burning Rickard Stark rather, and killing Brandon Stark, or torturing whoever it was. So by implication, Arthur Dane should be condemned along the same lines. He stood there while Aerys did all these things and he did nothing. And then, in fact, he's helping Rhaegar run around and do whatever Rhaegar wants to do, which is further kind of destabilizing the realm. You can certainly make that argument. So we don't have a lot to go on with Arthur, but yeah, we've got no reason to believe that he's perfect and every reason to question it.
I mean, presumably he stood by while this guy was trying to get to his sister, who was pregnant and on her birthbed / deathbed, and apparently Arthur fought this guy for like something, the Kingsguard and the others, you have that othering where it's like you're just an obstacle. You're not a force for good by being in my way. You're not protecting that thing behind that you're supposed to be protecting in the way that you think you are by not letting Ned through to the tower.
Right, because knights are supposed to protect the weak, but
Yeah.
these Kingsguard knights have been pulled pretty far away from those vows, and Jamie reflects on that very thing. So that's kind of a good example of what you're talking about there. Another theme that Helen mentioned is revenge, and certainly George spends a lot of ink showing us how revenge is never satisfying, right? And that's kind of the sadness of Arya's story. We can see so much of her energy is consumed with revenge, and we know that's not going to be satisfying.
Yeah, it's her only tether is this vengeance. You know, that's the only thing holding her to being a Stark is who did my family wrong, who did me wrong, who did, you know, the Starks wrong, basically. And that's the only lifeline she has in this. You know, she's being trained to be this super killer, and the only thing she remembers is hate and vengeance, and it's not good. It's not a good. It's not going to work out well.
And again, this is another thing where in a nihilistic story, the author wouldn't be wasting time showing us the fruits of revenge and how that works. And it goes back to just what we were taking with Ilaria Sand. You know, great. So we have revenge. They're going to take revenge, and then their children take revenge. And who is satisfied in any of this, right? So
it's also like a PR thing, right? That's what I meant to say. Yeah, it's like a social thing. How you're seen by the people and how you're remembered matters more than almost anything else, than how you lived. Like think about Daemon II, Blackfire, how, you know, falling down in the mud and making an ass out of himself and getting called a brown dragon, and that was it. He was done. He was never going to be socially anything at all. Everyone was going to know the story of the brown dragon, and he sucks, and that was that. You know, as opposed to, you know, Arion, who Bright Flame, who everybody knows is a jerk, but he's, you know, socially he's you know, one of the ruling class, one of the people. We don't talk about him, but when Daemon II makes a run for it, PR was everything, and he failed. He flopped.
Yeah, the reputation thing is interesting because we were just talking about Jamie. His most noble act was that he was the one Kingsguard who finally stepped up and did something about Ares. You can argue he didn't have to kill him to stop them from burning down King's Landing, but
I'm not going to argue that.
yeah, right. It worked. He saved everyone, so you know there's that. So yeah, and I've also said that, you know, I'm obviously a defender of Dany's character. I do think that ultimately she's going to see through the trap of the Iron Throne, realize the only real moral use of the dragons is to head north, and I think her story will end heroically and self-sacrificially in the north. Blah 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 blah. However, it's pretty obvious that George is playing with this idea that Dany is going to be viewed as the Mad Queen's daughter. The rumors are already flying all around the world about Daenerys. And when she does get to King's Landing, to the extent that she's going to try to take it probably from Fagon, you probably will see wildfire go off. And we're going to see a lot of tragedy. And I think that Dany will be, you know, horrified by that, and that this will catalyze her to sort of change her goals or whatever. But the point is, a lot of people will remember Dany as a villain. Even if she goes up north and saves the world with Jon, a lot of people will think of her as the villain, just as Jaime is remembered as the Kingslayer, even though he saved everyone from Mad King Ares. So
absolutely, yeah. And the PR is so important because people so far have not understood what Daenerys is doing. From an outside perspective, she just climbed into a fire. What is she thinking? But she's honoring the tradition of the, you know, of the Dothraki, or she's feeling that this is her time. It's her time to, you know, she's called into the flame. She's doing this thing. One cannot say why she did this thing, but she did this thing. And she is already unpredictable in that way. So for any of the small folk to refer to her as the Mad Queen is not an indictment of her madness. They just don't understand at that level that we can see through her, you know, point of view. Um, she is experiencing something very different, than even what the people right next to her are experiencing. And one of the best ones that I found, actually, I was looking through one of her chapters in Game of Thrones. She calls Jorah over to feel the eggs because Dany feels that they're warm. And she asks Jorah to feel them, and he's like, no, it's cold. It's stone cold. As in, she's having this like divine moment where she's experiencing something in this world. It's not in a green dream. It's not in it's here, and she's experiencing something different than what Jorah's experiencing. He feels a cold rock, and she's like, no, I can feel the heat like coming off of him. So like, and she is just a magical. She's even Jorah would say that she's mad sometimes because he doesn't understand what she's going through at all.
So that's a good example of what I'm talking about when I say that George takes a trope, says, what would it really be like? And if people really did have magic visions, they would look crazy to other people.
Absolutely.
And they would believe in things that make them sound crazy. And then other people would be like, you're fucking crazy. And so we see that happening.
Actually, and it's so like George. I think one of the key things that people miss in their analysis of George is he's a chess player. He loved chess. He was on the chess team. He made us this chess game in a book, and he makes these people follow these preordained chess moves. But he is like, masterfully crafting this, he's like a chess player, you know what I mean? Like everybody, you are playing chess against the board. You don't know what the other side is doing. And he uses this to the advantage of his characters. And that's one of the things that is so awesome about George is he doesn't waste a single word. He doesn't waste a single character, a situation, a word. Nothing is extra about the books. I mean, if you read I was just saying I tried to read a Terry Goodkind book, and it was just really long, really long, and it didn't need to be that long.
George will straight up ruin you for other authors because you're right. Every word is intentional. I compare it to like TV shows like The Watchmen or Dark is an even better example, where every scene and line of dialogue has three different purposes.
Absolutely.
That's a high level writing.
And I mean, if you're just reading, this series on the surface, like when I first read these books, I didn't think that there was any like sub layer at all. If somebody had a moon face, it meant that their face was round. It didn't mean all this stuff that I now know because I listen to you. But if you read this book just on the surface, it's clever, it's witty. It is not. I mean, this guy, the thread that we were just on, he was downing this, George's work for being like pornographic and depraved. And it's not. It's visceral, but so is the human experience. If you write a book where somebody just goes back to their room and goes to sleep, like George says about Tolkien, he says, it's easy for a writer to say, oh, Aragorn ruled for 1,000 years and was a good king. It's hard to say this good man didn't make a good king and his rule was problematic from there on out. And, and then what did you even end your story for? George knows that. George, that's not how the real world works. Yeah.
Right. So, that's, I mean, we can sort of say it 5 different ways, but I mean, it's like just because the hero doesn't have the, like balloons and then we all ate ice cream at the end doesn't mean that they're not a hero or didn't do the right thing or that heroism isn't a thing.
Right. It's realistic to think of, of the future being ideal. And that's something that George makes us question. He puts his characters at so low a point. We ourselves wonder what the ideal is for this person. Like Theon. I mean, Theon went through a living resurrection. He was one person, then he was another person, then he's back to being Theon. Like he gets this resurrection story again and again and again because George wants us to understand that people can do good despite being like literally having their fingers ripped off. Like Theon, something changes in his head and he turns this into I am me. Like I know my name. He's calling himself, a man. He's calling himself Theon. Whatever transformation he went through, he is stronger than that boy that showed up at Pike and hit on his sister, and everything that he was before, he is much deadlier and much more capable of greatness almost. And
yeah, exactly. So this is another theme that I think is crystallizing in my mind is piercing illusion in the context of personal transformation. Personal transformation, getting older, becoming wise, most of it revolves around coming to understand yourself and understand the world and how those two things interact. And so when you're talking about Theon, he has so much false pride and illusion and stuff that needs to be broken down before he can become a real person who actually has real conviction on his own. And that is essentially what we watch. So George uses.
Can I just step away for 1 second? I'm so sorry. I really gotta use the bathroom. I'm so sorry. I'll be right back.
Absolutely, yeah. No problem. We got two people. We're all good, buddy. So I will just wait for Austin to come back. Austin's doing really well. Make sure we give him a shout out when he comes back. He's doing great here. So yeah, we talked about this. George really has gravitated towards mythology about transformation, like the cycle of the seasons and the whole Venus, morning star, even star, light and dark sort of thing, because it's, good fiction turns on the growth of the characters. Like when you talk about a character arc, an arc implies motion. It implies, change and growth, essentially. You start in one place, you learn the lessons, you get to the end, and then it's fulfilling. It's satisfying. And so George he's chosen mythology that is very transformative so that he can layer it on top of these characters and show us how their growth through the story transforms them. So Theon's a great example of that. How his illusions are shattered and broken down so that the new person can be born. And it's really how life works. You go through things, tragedies, losses, things that didn't work out, and you come out stronger on the other side. And then you start to become the kind of gritty person with substance and experience and a nice thick beard like Austin Flowers. No, I'm just kidding. Beard has nothing to do with anything, but welcome back.
Thanks, man. It's because I'm losing it on top. I'm going towards Stannis, man, real fast.
It's migrating. You could do it. You could do a Stannis. You need to like not eat for 3 days or something, or just maybe stay up for all night, and then you look more like Stannis because you look vibrant and healthy. And Stannis has a little bit of an emaciated thing going on. But I asked the chat to applaud for how wonderful a job you're doing so far. I don't know if you have the chat open.
Man, thank you. Oh, you guys are so good. I'm just getting distracted left and right. I have like a bloodhound sensibility when it comes to following up points because I will follow things way too far.
Well, I'm here to crack the whip and steer things in some direction. No, it's fine. It's a pretty open discussion. It wasn't really that hard to shoot down the basic premise of it. I think, like full disclosure, the person who did this tweet thread, they are a religious person. They seem to have kind of puritanical sort of sensibilities. And it seems like they're just offended probably by some of the stuff on the TV show more than what's in the books.
It seemed that way, yeah. It was more.
And then they're sort of reacting to it like, "Ooh, this is gross. This is so negative," and so blah blah blah. But I pointed out that like the Bible has more violence and deviant sex than A Song of Ice and Fire. You could argue. That doesn't mean the Bible's nihilistic. Obviously, it's not. It's the opposite of that. It's a religious text. But
is it the opposite? Really, not to go on the air and question the Bible, but it says,
oh boy,
that it itself says everything matters because God says it matters, but that in itself is nihilistic and dualistic, saying that without that, there is a way that nothing matters, but
So
God is
I do
everything.
agree with that critique of Christianity in particular, but let's set that aside.
Right. Yeah. Totally.
Okay.
Not here, not now. Yeah.
The point is, there's when you talk about the philosophy, we're talking about, is there hope? Is there a meaning to stuff? Now, I agree that it's actually, there's an argument with, I would say, with probably modern fundamentalist Christians more than anyone else about where morality comes from. Like, some Christians will say, well, if you don't believe in God, then you don't have a basis for morality. You're basically making the counter argument that, like, it's actually better to think that we have an intrinsic morality as opposed to one that's enforced upon us, by an external thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, the books, like I said, they kind of spell out the same thing. The the worship of the old gods, or the worship of these religions across in Essos and all this sort of stuff that are heavy into sacrifice and all of these things. George is showing us that good people will believe these religions, for no other reason than it's what they're brought up with. It's what they know. Like Melisandre and the Red Priests, most of those priests, I think it says somewhere, are inducted as when they're kids and they have no choice.
Yeah, they're slaves. Yeah, they're bought by the Red Temple. Exactly. Yeah.
And like when you I think you posted about Danny and the Unsullied. Like, the Unsullied is a great metaphor for morality. Like, here's these here's these trained killers, and even though what's happening in that chapter is Danny talking to the slave masters, what we're doing as the reader is we're finding out all this stuff about the Unsullied. It's like we feel more for the Unsullied at the end of that, at the end of her discourse with the slave master, than we care about the old guy in the first 5 minutes of Up. Like, we just have learned that these kids are abused and just just messed with and screwed with, and their heads are just a scramble. And we connect with the want to save these people. And Danny does something heroic. She puts herself right in the middle of the action. She does, like, I would say, Jaehaerys the first level type of clever way to diffuse the situation by just allowing it to hatch. And here's this egg. All these 10,000, how many, 3,000 they had, all hate what's going on, and she just let that situation open up. She's like, you really hate what's going on, do something about it. And they're like, yeah. And they kill the slave masters. And it's not nihilistic at all. There are things to believe in. That's these kids were picked up at a young age, and inherently they know what has happened to them is wrong. And then there's, on the other side of that, there's characters like Varys, who's a eunuch, supposedly. I don't know if he is or not, but if he is a eunuch, he now keeps kids and trains them to do his dirty work in his business.
Right.
And he went from being the oppressed to being the oppressor, whereas Danny goes from being the oppressed to
being a liberator.
A liberator, yeah.
Danny contrasts very well with Cersei too, because Cersei responds to a much lower level of oppression, still significant gender oppression, as well as like just messed up expectations of her father or whatever. And she goes from there to being a person who's consumed with bitterness and rage and would be capable of killing a bunch of people. Arya's somewhere in the middle, where we're mostly sympathetic for her desire for revenge because she was wronged, but we're afraid of what she's becoming. Good Lord, the chapter in Winds of Winter where she kills one of the bloody mummers, I forget which one. It's fun that like we get to see the bloody mummer get his comeuppance, but it's not really fun to see an 11-year-old girl use her sexuality to lure a guy into a room and then cut his leg and dump him in the canal. Like that's tough. But I'm trying to reel in. It's so easy to get lost in tangents with this subject. There's so many good things to talk about. There was a great comment here from Isabella in the chat that I want to highlight here. Morality comes from empathy. When you recognize humanity in the other and you understand your free will is limited by the well-being and care for other people. So someone else said that a biologist would say that social cooperation is something that we evolved because it enhances our survival.
Maybe.
Maybe. Okay. Maybe. Well, if it's all theory,
no, I'm not.
right?
I'm not sure it wasn't already there. I mean, we could have evolved that before. Like we're just learning now that dinosaurs looked after their young. Like we could have learned.
I think that's what I think that's the point, is that this comes from our entire evolution from the animal kingdom. Because obviously, okay. So empathy is essentially a more touchy-feely way of describing that social construct, realizing that your neighbor, you have a stake in your neighbor's well-being. You can think about that from a tactics point of view or from an emotional point of view, but it's just two sides of the same coin. So empathy really is the basis for morality, and that's where the golden rule comes from. Because if you don't care about who else's rights and happiness you're violating, well then you don't have empathy, and that's essentially what makes you amoral. So that you can see the two sides of the coin here.
Yeah, and Danny and John, John is told that the wildlings are not his people, that they are who the brotherhood of which he is a part is against, but he sees that they are in trouble and he helps them. Danny, she sees that these people need to be freed, the Unsullied need to be freed, and she helps them. She goes through, she sees the people in need of help are her people. There is no question. They didn't come from Astapor, they didn't come from the Yunkai, they didn't come from Marine, they didn't come from anywhere. If they're suffering, they are her people. She recognizes that. John, we get that polar negative. The wildlings are who you hate. Oh, but you're showing compassion for them. Oh, okay. So he shows us that very stark contrast. And Danny shows us this compassionate thing. We do not know why she suddenly decides to give a shit, but she does. And
actually, we do know why. She does explain it. It's more subtle, but she says two different things to Jorah and Barristan the night before trying to free the Unsullied, which is one, why else do the gods make kings if not to protect those who can't protect themselves? And before that, she tells Jorah, do you know what it's like to be sold? I do. I remember, Drogo was kind to me, but for that, it could have been much worse. And we see her empathizing with the prisoners of war at the end of Game of Thrones when the Dothraki raid the village of the Lamb Men, and she stops some of the rape and pillaging that's going on to protect people. So Dany identifies with the downtrodden. She starts the story being sold to the Dothraki, who feed slaves into the slavery system. So when she's ends up in Slaver's Bay and starts taking apart that system, or trying to, that's the same thing that ensnared her at the very beginning of the story. So I think that's why she sympathizes with them. Besides just being a decent person, her own experience as being sold informs that. So I'm glad that you brought up John and the wildlings, because I think that these two actions, John letting the wildlings through the wall, which the seeds are sown, Mormont, Lord Commander Mormont sows the seeds for that in the first book. When he mentions to John, he's like, in the end, the wildlings are just men. So he sort of starts to diffuse that mythology of the wildlings as being monsters who drink blood from the skulls and worship whatever gods. And like, everybody worships weird gods, and a lot of people drink blood. And at the end of the day, the wildlings actually are just men. So that seed that Mormont plant eventually blooms in John, because of course John goes over and spends time with the wildlings and then comes back with a different perspective than almost anyone else on the Night's Watch. And at the end, he takes the just action of letting the wildlings through the wall. And so a couple of things I want to point. I want to talk about reconciliation, and I want to talk about the fact that essentially John letting the wildlings through the wall and Dany liberating the Unsullied and going on and to smash the slave trade, quote unquote. These are the two most moral actions taken in the story. You could also put Jaime's killing of King Ares up there too, quite honestly, because it saves the lives of so many people. But just thinking about Jon and Dany's actions, these are two of the only things that people do to try to make the world a better place in a permanent way, taking actions that go beyond their own desires and scope to really try to change the actual world. And so that is what makes Jon and Dany heroes, not the Azor Ahai prophecy. It is that willingness to throw themselves in the breach, to lay their lives on the line, and to try to make the world a better place, despite all the things that have happened to them. So I think that this will be something that they bond over, and I've talked about that. But to the point of our conversation, it does show you that there is a heroic ideal. George isn't showing us that heroes are just doomed and evil and nobody's a hero or whatever. Like, no, these are very heroic actions taken by these main characters.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And they don't, the thing is that George wrote them in, they don't have to do this thing. The wildlings are on the other side of an ice wall. And although that we just had that skirmish, they're not going to get through unless we let them, for the most part. But the even more obvious one is the Unsullied. Dany was already going to walk away with some Unsullied. She had a little bit of her army there. She had arguably what she came for. She makes the argument that it's nowhere near enough, and she's right. But she takes that gamble and frees them because of what she learns in that chapter. Not her preconceived notion that this is an army coming in, but that, like you said, she goes through the process of realizing, no, this isn't an army. These are slaves that you have messed with and are in a bad position right now. And like, that's
basically
the trick, right?
She decides that it's morally unacceptable to buy the slaves and benefit from this practice. Instead, she's like, if I'm going to take these people, I'm actually going to use that power to stamp out the practice so that no more puppies are strangled, no more babies are stolen, no more kids are taken to be unsullied, etc. So yeah, it's the most moral action that anyone takes in the story. Like I said, it's right up there anyway. So reconciliation, speaking of Jon and the wildlings, like the fact that George has made a big wall and put something called the others on the other side of the wall, it's like, it's pretty fucking hard to miss what this story is about. Otherization. And then the actual people on the other side of that wall have been otherized, meaning they have been turned into the scary outside group that we've got to build a wall against. Does this sound familiar? Right. From American politics? Yeah. It's very it's totally old. It's just tribalism. It's as old as, chimps, right? I mean, this is something that we've taken from the animal kingdom and are essentially trying to grow out of. Because empathy, again, this is a polar opposite. Empathy is common shared humanity. Tribalism seeks to remove the empathy of the otherized group. That's what otherization means. It means to remove their humanity in the sight of the people that are looking at them. So the wildlings are monsters. We don't need to save their lives, whatever. And even the others themselves, they're going to turn, just fighting them is not the answer. We all know there has to be some sort of reconciliation with the others. It's, we could go off speculating, and I have, about what that involves. Green Seers, the Weirwood Net, whatever it is. But the whole point of making a wall and showing us otherized people, it's this reconciliation is the point. Like, you could talk about the Jungian idea of reconciling yourself to your own shadow. Certainly George is talking about that. The wildlings themselves need to be reconciled to Westeros, and that's what Jon begins the process of, I think, in a foreshadowing of Jon working to reconcile the others in a magical way at the end of the story. But reconciliation is a big theme. So your turn. Go ahead.
It definitely. And I think there's a lot of self-reconciliation that both Jon and Daenerys do. They both have to come to terms with their own feelings right off the bat. And it's not through it's not through punishment or by cause and effect. They're just going into situations and like you said, like learning about the situation. They're not being shut off from the situation, and that's a really subtle thing. They're open to the situation, and communication is the beginning of reconciliation. And so they're reconciling their own beliefs about what John thinks the wildlings are versus what they actually are. Like in, they only
Right.
have these spaced out chapters to do this in, and George does it really well. Danny goes in to buy some slaves and comes out with an entire army, not having spent a penny, because she reconciled what was going on, the feelings within herself, and went, this is not right. And the themes, any theme that you could apply to books, George forces the reader to go through. When they question their morals, we question our morals. And when they try to reconcile, ideas and people in their head, we try to do that in our head.
Right. The debate about Danny's actions in Slaver's Bay, well, it was started by Danny, who questions herself and wonders if she's a monster or if she's done the right thing by crucifying the slave lord. So obviously George is inviting us to think about it. George also mentions the Tyrells murdering Joffrey. Like, was that just? Joffrey was a monster. He's also a 13-year-old.
Yeah, right.
Discuss, right? Debate amongst yourselves. One thing I did want to point out and kick to you, since we mentioned some of the biblical stuff. Danny, with the Unsullied, specifically when she gets that whip and whips the slave master, it really feels like Jesus in the temple and the money changers to me, doesn't it? I mean, because it's that same holy, uncompromising stance that you highlighted about Jesus. That's exactly the path that Danny takes there.
He puts his foot down. He doesn't, even Jesus isn't necessarily against, like,
money
not
changers existing, right?
Yeah, he's not against what they're doing, but I mean, what they're doing in particular, he's against what they're trading. It's, people, it's slaves. Same like Daenerys. She's upset that this is the practice. This is how these cities thrive. This is what their world revolves around. And this is sickening. And it's the same revelation that I think Jesus comes to. I'm having trouble remembering that one, but what they're doing is totally uncouth. It's bad. It feels bad. And Daenerys knows it. It feels terrible. This guy is a jerk, and she is understanding what he's saying just to reinforce the idea that he's a jerk. Like, that what they're doing is not right. And it's based on things that on expectations of situations are going to come out in their favor, and they seem really entitled. And she, catches that these people are immoral people doing immoral things.
There you go. Yeah, I love the way she sort of uses their hubris against them. It's very clever.
It's great.
But it's almost one of those sort of just like vibe things. Like, the emotion of this scene in general really reminds me of that scene, like I said, with Jesus, literally whipping the moneylenders out of the temple. Because they're gathered in the Plaza of Pride. It's not quite a temple, but it feels, like a central important location. And then of course she does whip the slave master, and then Drogon, takes over. So,
and there's that theme of like sacrifice, because Jesus, as an otherwise perfect person, would not use violence in a situation, but sometimes you have to sacrifice what you believe about violence to do this thing. I mean, sacrifice is obviously one of those overarching themes in the book. What are you willing to give in order to gain something else? And Danny is not willing to give anything that she holds dear, anything that she holds precious. She gambles on, giving away Drogon, but she doesn't give him away. There's not like that, in at no point was Drogon the slave master's dragon. It didn't feel like that. She wasn't, maybe that's a precursor to something that will happen, that she'll be, ensorcelled or forced to give her dragon away. But at no point was she outside her agency in that situation. She, a revelation was like, she comes to situations and they crack, just like the eggs did. She came into the eggs and they hatched. They got warm and they hatched. They got you know, it was obviously going to take place down the line. They were getting warmer. It was getting more expectant. She was getting stronger. And then that situation that she was on burst open. And the same thing happens to every situation that Daenerys touches. And it's because she takes this like morally divine path. She is divine and graceful. And this is something that not a lot of people talk about, but even, you know, John in his black and white stark contrast, you know, I'm doing the right thing because I learned the wildlings are people, therefore people deserve better, therefore A plus B equals C, I'm doing the right thing. Meanwhile, Daenerys emotionally feels this thing. She does not know why she walks into the fire. She only knows that it's time. She doesn't know why she walks down to Drogon in the fighting pit and gets on his back and leaves, but she knows that it's right for her. So like the characters are taking these two different paths, and George is telling us that there's a moral path from knowledge based on what you know.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Okay.
There's a moral path from compassion, seeing and feeling what's right in front of you. The way he describes what Dany sees in her chapters with, you know, as she was riding through the Khalasar and other, there's just raping women all around, and that's Dothraki custom. You see it with her, and you're like, that's not. What kind of custom is that? Like, you gotta. Yeah, the first thing you should do when you get in office is maybe just pull that one back just a little. And she does it. She rides straight there and tries to, you know, intercede. And she keeps making that moral decision from a place of just seeing what it is and knowing that it's wrong. Yes, she remembers being sold. She remembers, you know, having, you know, you could say consensual sex with Drogo, but it was more like, it was definitely something she wasn't ready for, even though it didn't happen right away. And
well, it's one of those situations where, like she says herself, she was sold, and it was only because Drogo turned out to be kind. You could say once their relationship, once she established some power in the relationship, it evolved into something consensual. But yeah, that's a complex thing in and of itself. But yeah, that's essentially the way to say it, I think.
And that's another thing, like the women's power. Where do women even get their power in fantasy books? And I feel like a lot of critiques end because people don't understand where Daenerys gets her power from, or where Cersei gets her power from, or that she just lost it, and how that's going to play into what goes on. I mean, if people really love Aegon and he gets there and he sees this queen who's mostly still bald, like in that shaggy in-between phase, and there's stories about her getting shamed and walking naked through the kingdom, that's not going to be the young and beautiful queen that he wants to marry. That's, you know, like you see how these how important it is to have these moments of compassion, I guess, is what I'm saying. Like, it's important to view so what makes women powerful? Sorry, dude, I told you I get off topic all the time.
Well, flesh that idea out a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that's the question, right? What makes women powerful? I have trouble thinking in that sense because I am not a woman, and I would kill to know what women really think about where Daenerys gets her balls from, like her chutzpah, her gall, why, on what engine she's able to change the world around her that in some way Jon is not. Because here we are given this parallel story, but Jon dies and Dany doesn't. She goes through character resurrection after character resurrection. So you could say, where did Jon go wrong and Dany didn't? And what gives her the power to make the decisions in the future that are going to change everything? And it's not just being a Targaryen. Targaryens aren't fireproof. Just because you're a Targaryen doesn't mean that you're not going to get killed the second the chance comes along. Some freak mace or something's going to hit you in the back of the head, and that's it. She actually puts herself into situations where she should be dead, and she's not. And she walks out of it just fine. She walks out of it born anew, refreshed. So where does her magical power, but where does that power that, you know, that people see? Because they are seeing these miracles, but it's very dragon driven miracles. She's relying on her, people see the majesty of her dragons. But before that, when she was just a girl, they didn't see the magic of anything. She wasn't recognized at all for being anything, no matter how compassionate she was. As the Khaal's wife, she was always just the Khaleesi. She wasn't powerful until Drogo fell in love with her. And this is where George talks about, love being the death of duty. Men understand duty and men understand honor. But we also have to understand that that means nothing in the face of love. And I don't want to even say that women's power comes to where they can influence men, but when you think of, the head of the household, I've always heard that women are the neck. Men are the head of the household, but women are the neck. The head does whatever the neck tells it to do. And Catelyn's a good example. Catelyn says, Ned, you should go for this hand job. you should take the hand position. Because
okay, sorry, that took me a second. That got me. Yeah, so just to put an asterisk on what you're saying, yeah, in a medieval type of society, which is obviously patriarchal, that is how it functions. The man is the outward head, and then you often see people like Catelyn as the sort of the brains behind the operation. Yeah, sure. That's sometimes how it sorts out. Daenerys is transcending that, though, which is what's interesting, is because she's taking on the role of Cal and king or queen or whatever, titles you want to give her. So she's okay. So she's transcended that. The other thing is that her strength, actually, the moment it starts is when she has that dragon dream in her 3rd chapter, and she wakes it sort of purifies her. She lets the fire she like gives into it, right? So you could say gives into her fate. The dragon bathes her. She awakens with strength the next day, and that's when she starts mastering her situation and taking power in the Khalasar. Because Drogo, the Dothraki only respects strength, and Daenerys gained power as a Khaleesi. She made that Khaleesi position can be different things. She could just be a woman that stays in Drogo's tent and takes his abuse and pleases him when he wants to, and that's it. She turned it into a powerful position successfully by gaining the respect of the Dothraki, learning their customs, showing mastery of riding and other skills, navigating situations like eating the horse hard and the customs and all that stuff. So,
but then she became somebody that people would morally follow. She became the ruler. And and when Aemon talks about gender, the gender is as changeable as flame. If you have a good ruler, it doesn't matter if they're male or female or not, because the power doesn't lie with, in actuality, what you can make other people do. It's in liberation. It's in freedom. No one is arguing with Daenerys when she is done with them. Either they're dead or they're thankful to be out from under their oppressors. No, and she's not out there killing haters and killing people who disagree with her at all. She's allowing them to have that moment of, now you're free. Now run, get out of here. Take what you can. Take everything on your back that you can carry and go. She's giving people this opportunity to go form something new and to be something new and to break their chains. And she almost takes every opportunity she can to give in to her fate, to step in front of what's going on, what's right in front of her, threatening her people and her people. She gets right in there and steps in and is divine, how you would think of a king should lead an army. How Robert Baratheon led an army. That's how Daenerys leads her army. She leads from the front. She goes to the heart of the matter. And this is why, I said, this is why the show is terrible, because they didn't empower her character at all to make this decision. They took the writing George had, but then once they got out of that, they just empowered her to pretty much take what was offered, to take the deal. The way show Daenerys ended, she would have taken the little bit of the Unsullied, paid what she had, and gone away and left the rest of them there. That's not book Daenerys at all. She's uncompromisingly moral at every turn. Even when it comes to herself or her people, she chooses her people.
Well, that's the way a Storm of Swords ends, is with Dany being offered the ships to sail to Westeros, and she's like, no, I can't do it. I got to stay here and sort things out. So yeah, I'm gonna talk about that more in my next produced video, which is going to be the Dany character study that I've been putting off for like a year. But to go back to the inner strength thing, I was pointing out that it comes from the dragon dream, because I think George is using the dragon as a symbol there, not of destruction and fire and blood, but of more the Eastern sense of transcendence, spiritual knowledge, and things like that. Because she has this dream, she sees the dragon, and then she becomes reborn with inner strength. And every time she thinks about the dragon in the first couple of books, it's as a source of inner strength. So I feel like it symbolizes her. Somebody in the chat said resilience, survival instinct. It symbolizes like herself, but like her highest self or her spirit, her will, something like that. She's drawing strength from this image of the dragon, but it's really just reflecting her own sort of inner fire. And that's what's pushing her through this whole thing. I mean, it comes from her.
I mean, yeah, and the dragon, like the dragon in its, as we seem to imagine the abstract idea, as well as literal dragons, just like the others, are uncompromising equalizers. They, when the wall comes down, all the fires go out. They killed men and horse alike. They do all this stuff. The others are just painted as equalizers throughout. It doesn't matter if you're a king or a prince. We're all the same when the long night comes. It's the same with the dragons, and that's what she's exposing. Is she's tearing down the power structure that is. That's why Book Dany will never take the Iron Throne. She will tear down the foundation that it's sitting on, and everybody along with it. All these people that just jumped ship from Aerys to Robert, like Varys and Littlefinger, and all the old relationships existed. It was just a different guy sitting on the throne. Nothing else really changed. Daenerys is going to change all of that, because she does not take what is offered. She does what is right.
Yeah, that's a really good point. She is very much the cleansing fire. In a lot of cases, she's tearing down the corruption so that something new can be, can grow in its place. So it's actually, it's complex, and it goes back to the whole dragons don't plant trees, but forest fires are a part of the natural forest life cycle. And Dany actually does plant trees, but I don't want to get lost on Dany too much. I want to save that. One thing that I did want to get back to.
Yeah,
let me see. Let me pull up. Well, so first of all, there's a super chat or a PayPal that came in from Christopher saying, this is a particularly simplistic view, but I feel it could be argued that A Song of Ice and Fire is fundamentally a comedy in the classic definition of the term, where the structure of a comedy is fundamentally life-affirming. In the case of Martin, I think it's all the more meaningful if the characters have suffered and struggled and yet still survive. It's the song within the series, the burden and joy of life. So I would agree with that. And I would say it has both of elements of tragedy and comedy. And even tragedy is built on romanticism, which is a fundamentally, it's not nihilistic at all. It says that if nothing means anything, then tragedy doesn't even exist.
Yeah, and that's a really good point to bring up that Shakespearean thing, because like his tragedies, his characters have a moment to be vulnerable, and they even analyze what's going on in their motivation. Like Hamlet sitting there with the skull and talking about it, talking to it about the nature of life and destiny and fate, and then goes on to do the same thing that killed his father. He goes on to, be as cutthroat. He doesn't break the wheel in any way. He doesn't change the cycle of killing and of madness and desire. And
right.
that's like the tragedy end of it. Like George is a comedy in that it's going to end on the upswing. But the upswing, like he said, like, with the scouring of the Shire comments, the upswing is not going to look like what we all think it's going to look like, which is, the happy king ruled for 1,000 years. There's not going to be a king. There's not going to be a centralized king. And I think it's paraphrasing when they say, oh, it's going to be King Bran at the end of it. I think people are just going to remember that Bran is out there somewhere, that he's the king and the old gods and whatever. I don't think there's actually going to be a King Bran that you can go to and see. And, there's not going to be a king in the traditional sense, because kingship does not work time and time again. And it doesn't matter who's on the throne, because, that theme that George has, that's the only way that we can come out of this, because for all the kings that have been in power, for all the fire and blood that has gone down, it's never perfect. It's never a positive for every single person. Some, at best, like Jaehaerys the First, that's like 96% there. But then there's these little problems that get eked out just because the system exists the way it does. And that's just real life. And George knows that corruption exists at the highest levels of government, and that no government is, free of that.
Yeah, it's a question we're still wrestling with, as far as, is there even a just way to have a government? It's a fun question to debate at parties, for sure. Related point here from Sydney. I always believed that Dany was going to realize that she didn't want the Iron Throne anymore, and that she dismantled the Iron Throne in the show. So the Iron Throne as a symbol is very important. It's the false prize. As I sort of brush the cockatoo dust off my shoulder here. Like at the very beginning of the story, the wildling Osha tells Bran that Robb's going the wrong way by marching south and engaging in the Game of Thrones. He should be guarding the realm against the existential threat, which is the others. But that's what they symbolize, is climate change or any sort of existential threat to everyone that people might not be dealing with in favor of more selfish goals. So the Iron Throne, that's what it symbolizes. It's the Game of Thrones, the very vain exercise that those with power engage in that makes the people suffer. So that is more true for Dany than anybody else, that the Iron Throne symbolizes that this desire to regain the throne that she basically had foisted on her by Viserys, that she thinks that she wants. She's going to have to see through it, obviously. And I do believe that it's going to be torn down. I'm not sure how it's going to happen and when. But yeah, Daenerys, ultimately the climax, the moral climax of her story, will be seeing through the false prize of the throne and turning north with those dragons to save the world. I strongly agree with that.
Yeah, definitely. There's a real threat to people, and it's the system of, and it's not the system of oppression. George is showing us, like, I almost want to ask the question, because fantasy and sci-fi, they always rely on human, humanity and human emotion for the bulk of their narrative storytelling in order to drive the plot. And I wonder where George is taking his, oh goodness, I guess, like, shoot, what did I say in the notes? Oh yeah, like the world's evils, like people inherently can be evil. Even the Bible says people, actually, I don't know about that, but I've heard that people are inherently evil, and that we tend towards evil and tend towards chaos. But George almost asked the question, what if man's evils and the temptations of man and the evils of man permeated even nature? There's green seers in the trees with the temperament of men, that nature is acting with an intent, with an emotional intent towards certain things. It feels like I don't know if that's the truth. That's something that, you know, George isn't going to confirm. Like, yeah, there's people in the trees and they're, you know, they're doing what. That's not. He'll show you symbolically, but he'll never just come out and say it. But that theme is, you know, that man is so evil that he can. If he were to get into nature, you would have these trees that drink blood and are silently screaming.
I follow you. Yeah.
Controlling the weather, and it's like
or even the Relorism and the ice magic of the others is same idea.
Just showing
that's all fire of the gods stuff, which really gets back into the idea of how people use power. The fire of the gods representing like new technology, or just, you know, something that changes the world, a power or technology that can cut both ways, you know, like nuclear technology or chemistry in general. So
and it's, you know, it's like the desires of men, like Euron is one of my absolute favorite characters, because from a cursory perspective, he is the nihilist in the whole story. It seems as though he believes in nothing, but he doesn't actually. He believes in himself. He is high on how other people perceive him. That's what's getting him. I mean, he looks around and everybody is in fear of him on his boat. Everybody is having their own like mental degradation trip, but looking at him in fear, and he loves it. He is super high on it. He actually doesn't want nothing. He wants to be feared and revered as a god. He wants to be seen as a god. That's not nothing at all. That's, you know, narcissistic, that's psychopathic, sociopathic, whatever it is.
Right, yeah.
He wants to be perceived that way, and it's evident. I mean, he gives his brother drugs in order for his brother to view him that way. In order for he can't even talk to him without controlling how he's seen.
Right.
You know, and he has the smiling eye and the other eye, and George is showing us that this guy is all about image. He's all about, he wants to be perceived as a god, as an all-knowing, all-commanding being. And that's, you know, everything about him is built to that, and he's not nihilistic at all. He believes.
So if George were nihilistic, though, Euron would win, right? Or the others would win, or something that.
How far does man's desire take him? Don't you think Euron will win to a certain degree? I mean, Euron's folly, as Old Man tells us, we know is going to be that he does not know fear.
Exactly. I think he'll be successful for a time, and then he'll have a great, you know, a great fall, like a tremendous fall.
I mean, maybe and we
can the high tower.
I wish, you know, we could, you know, say that his trajectory, though, that he will lose, but by all accounts, I mean, it's what people see of him. Like, I think one of the coolest things that I ever heard of was Genghis Khan. And I know that, you know, the Dothraki are more like Mongol and Hun and kind of symbolism, but Genghis Khan used to do something really special. He would bring people, you know, he would bring these warriors in that he had conquered, and he would bring them into his tent, into one part of his tent, and he would sit them down to a lavish dinner with foods and spices from distant lands they never had. And then he would bust out the hash and get them super high for the first time in their lives, give them alcohol, get them crossfaded and blasted, and these guys would be out of their mind. And the tent flaps would roll up, and all these women would come out, and the camp prostitutes, and the men would have this night that they did not understand. This was the first night that they've had in their lives that is like this, that they've eaten food and that a woman has wanted them. And these are dirty warriors, and what the hell is happening? And when they wake up in the morning, Genghis Khan would say, he would sit them down and he would say, that was heaven. That's what you get for eternity if you fight for me. And so these guys would fight to the bone because they had seen the other side. They had seen heaven. This was their, you know, ethnogenic experience, you know, with mind-altering drugs. And that's what Euron's doing to his brother. He's controlling the way his brother sees him. He's controlling through fear how everyone in his circle sees him. And he's going to do the same thing to Westeros to a degree. We'll see his dream come to fruition until his fear or his lack of fear gets the better of him. We'll see him win because this is a strong desire. This is a very human thing to do, to care about how other people see you, to the degree.
Euron is basically the Antichrist. That's who he is. And the Antichrist does have a period of success before losing. And I think he's comparable to Ar-Pharazôn from Lord of the Rings, or young Sauron, even perhaps kind of rolled into one. So yeah, we've talked about Euron a few times. He's definitely a great villain, and I agree with the person that said their anxiety is going to be on 100 when Dany meets him, as that will happen, I think. So
I'm
let's
so
see here.
interested in all that horn business, and man, that is going to be so mind-blowingly epic.
Let's see here. I'm just looking at the notes, see if there's any points that we didn't get to. So we pretty much hit them all.
Well, I mean, George writes himself in as a character in the way that he, like you said, he brings into this story his thoughts about war, being a conscientious objector, knowing that if you bring a gun, expect to get shot, or the only way that a sword can protect is to kill. It's not actually, you're not actually protecting the human race at large by wielding a sword. You're just protecting the person behind you. It's created this gradient, of this, the world is skewed somehow. And he writes that into his characters in a way, and writes himself in like that. And we know that he's trying to convey some of these tropes because it's completely evident. And yeah, I mean, there's so many characters who don't take the opportunity to be moral and to examine their own morality and go through a tough time, right? And it's funny because nobles never want to go through a tough time. They never want to sit down and say, okay, where does my power really come from? Because everyone around is going to go, no, where does it come from? Please, fill us in. They have to maintain that image, and they have to always be unflinching and unquestioning. But the morals aren't front and center in a feudal society. You can be any type of lord. You don't have to be good or moral to be a lord. And George is highlighting that for us, and he's making it so obvious. And I think that's where people would say that his books are very graphic, because he answers that what's the worst that could happen. He tells you what the worst that could happen is if you're, immoral or whatever. Not that the Boltons love the Starks, but they did to Theon what they did to Theon because they thought he roasted a couple Stark boys.
The other one I think of is Davos. What is the whole point of this entire dialogue about Azor Ahai and then Melisandre and Stannis maybe sacrificing a child to wake the dragon to save the long night, the eventual sacrifice of Shireen that we know is coming? Why does George stick this character of Davos in that scene to sit there and be like, his name is Edric, he's your nephew, the life of one boy is worth everything. And he's obviously wanting to have us at least think about that idea of, is there a justification for blood sacrifice? And that's what's at the heart of the Azor Ahai legend. And I discussed that in my video, Azor Ahai, the bad guy, of course. So y'all can check that out if you haven't. But it's definitely the character of Davos is put in that story to sort of drive that question forward. So it's obviously something that George cares about thinking about.
Right. And, why would he put these hero archetypes in who are, who do bad things? His characters question that. This is not a good thing to do. Azor Ahai killing his wife, Davos is that's kind of the last thing I would want to do. And we have to examine everything like that. about these books is, does this sound right for a character to do or to have done? Yeah.
So it's the interesting thing about the Azor Ahai thing is that, like I was talking about, it gives us this axis of, well, the hero, sometimes you got to do a little blood magic, versus Nissa's example of self-sacrifice. Dave and Dan, the showrunners of HBO, I feel like they failed the test a little bit on that one. And the ending they gave us was actually nihilistic, the end of the show, in that they showed us the character who's done the most good not being just killed by someone else. I mean, shit happens, right? Ned died, whatever.
Right.
But she betrayed her own values. Like Dany's core value was using her power to protect her people, to the point of thinking about her people as her children. The reason George uses that language is he wants us to think about a mother, either a mother goddess or a mother bear, defending her cubs. That's what Dany is like. So for Dany to turn her dragon fire on her own citizens, her own subjects, is a betrayal of her fundamental core belief. So doing that to the character essentially says to the audience that, like, yeah, no matter how hard you try to make the world a better place, you're still going to end up a monster and you can't escape that. Like, it's pretty friggin' depressing. And it's one of the reasons why I spend so much energy sort of trying to deconstruct it and argue that George definitely isn't going to that place with Dany's arc, because it just doesn't, that's just not the message that I'm seeing in the books overall. So it ties to this debate.
Yeah, I mean, Dany is going through the steps of learning what that power gradient and power shift means. She views anyone being oppressed at the lower end of this gradient as her people.
Right.
Meanwhile, she's never going to create a scenario where everyone is the lower gradient. Because she has dragons. Sure, yeah, she can start fire to anything, yeah. But she's never going to create that situation where the gradient is not her saving the people that need the most help. She's not going to create people needing help. She's not going to willingly hurt people.
Right. That doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't. And I think a lot of this just comes from, like, the patriarchal show, especially, but the patriarchal way it was expressed in Hollywood. It was, not that we just watch patriarchal movies. Like, Black Widow has one job to do in the movie versus Iron Man has another job to do, and it's sad. It shouldn't be this way at all. Well,
I don't watch any of that Avengers stuff, but I totally agree. The Mad Queen is one of those archetypes born out of patriarchy, and HBO gave us not one but two. It's like the Battle of the Mad Queens. It's like it's basically jumping the shark, to use a phrase. It's like taking a bad trope and then just jumping the shark with it. And
again
then
again and again.
The one remaining female character who didn't go mad, Sansa, and ended up queen. Well, she gave a speech basically justifying Dave and Dan's decision to have her be raped by Ramsay in season 5 or whatever it was, by saying, "Oh, it made me stronger and I don't regret it," and this or whatever she said. It was really gross. So
that was so weird.
Yeah, there's a lot of problems with the way that Dave and Dan landed that plane. I'm seeing a super chat pop up, which reminds me that I missed a couple. So let me go back and give everyone some gratitude. Alex says, "Is there a hidden meaning in the saying all men must die, all men must serve? Is that all men must die first in order to serve?" Sure, you could say that, meaning the death of, like, your foolish desires, the death of your ignorance. We talked about the personal transformation that people sometimes have to go through to become useful or real or authentic, genuine, actualized, whatever phrase you want to use there. So yeah, that's a good observation, Alex. I like that. And then let me Women of Ice and Fires. Did someone ring the patriarchy bell? Yes, we're always happy to talk about. I don't shy away from those kinds of topics when they are appropriate for discussion. Definitely.
Yeah, me neither. It's hard being a guy telling that the patriarchy exists, and you try not to support it, but then you are a guy, and it's just like it's hard to be at this table and discuss this thing, and I'm sure a lot of people have a lot better opinions on it, but yeah, it's down with the patriarchy. Song of Ice and Fire teaches us that Adam would have taken the apple and Eve would have thought about it, and I think that's one of the blazing holes in all of religion. If you're talking about a wiser like a wiser gender, women are definitely the wiser gender. Men are more honorable. They're great in all these ways, and all the warrior, the smith, and the father figures, they're great in these ways. But A Song of Ice and Fire is really like hitting on why the attributes of the woman are necessary, are absolutely like 100% like should be more a part of fiction and more a part of the end game, and why you can't save the world without a woman, or unless you are a woman. I don't know. That's why, like I said, like it's hard to understand, and that's why I say that Sansa is one of my least understood characters, because George writes her so well. It's hard to get her as a character because it's subtle, and that she's going through all these changes, and that's hard to relate to as a guy. And it took me until I heard Alt Swift X talking about Cersei losing her power with her beauty, to realize like, oh shoot, she had that opportunity to go through catharsis and didn't do it. She never,
Yeah, we're supposed to compare it to Jaime losing his hand, exactly, and see the different result.
Because on the surface she didn't lose a body part, but she did lose her image, her body. She actually lost her body.
Well, the hair was the symbol of the beauty, right? And then she was like exposed or whatever. Let's see, I had a thought earlier based on what you were saying.
Sorry, man.
I think it's okay. What George has done with the female characters by placing them in a patriarchal world is based on the different desires of those characters, say Brienne, Cersei, Arya, Sansa, Catelyn, Daenerys. He's asked himself the question, how would somebody with these desires respond to this sort of restraint and constraint? And he's had the characters answer that in different ways. Sansa is learning how to use courtesy as an armor. Arya has left behind her gender at many points in the story. Brienne is obviously trying to be a knight. You've got Catelyn, making decisions and trying to protect her family. Classic mother bear kind of role. But she's drawn out of her den and into the field of battle, literally onto the battlefield, trying to negotiate peace between Stannis and Renly.
Right.
Cersei obviously chafes against the patriarchy constantly in her inner monologue, and talks about, her resentment against, what Jaime can do and she can't, for just simple reason of her gender. She flips the gender a little bit, with like when she kind of has sex with Tanya Merriweather or whatever, however you want to say that. It's not even like a lesbian thing. She's imagining that she's Robert. So it's like, it's a weird power reversal thing. So you can see Cersei's whole arc is shaped by patriarchy as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, she's seeing where power comes from. She's having this sexual experience where she has felt her own power taken from her in other sexual experiences. Here she comes in and takes away this other power. She's this is her figuring out this power struggle, that she can be a ruler is exactly what she's seeing. Here you have this patriarchal society where the man is, meant to be a certain way, and then she is inflicting that on a woman. I mean, that George could have written a man in there, but he didn't have to. It's not a gender identity crisis. It's not a sexuality crisis.
It's a power thing. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a straight tug of war that Cersei wants to understand how it feels to inflict that. And she likes that. And that's all you need to know about where her character is headed.
Right. So this is another point I wanted to make as far as George's critique of patriarchy and how he does it. This is not something that you would get from an author who believes that nothing matters and that the point of the story is to show you that good people just get punished. Like, this is a deep well thought out critique of a certain kind of society. And the patriarchy that's in a feudal society kind of works as satire compared to our own society. We still have a patriarchal society. It's just a lot less overt in most ways than feudal society, but the parallels still work. So you make the points in a more obvious way. That's what satire does. But we're supposed to draw the comparison back to our current experience. So I do think A Song of Ice and Fire is written for a modern audience in that sense. And we are essentially supposed to critique it and the character's actions from an essentially modern point of view. And I don't think the criticism that George is making porn is correct. I saw that else in the thread, like, oh, it's, we talk about Dave and Dan doing torture porn because of the amount of time they spent just focusing on the brutality of Theon and Ramsay, whereas George never shows the torture on screen. He's concerned with the psychological effects of Theon and the torture. So when George is showing us, he does show us a lot of sexual violence. Obviously the Sansa chapters are very hard to read at some points in the second and third book with her abuse at the hands of Joffrey, right?
Yeah.
This is not done, however, to revel in or glorify or sadistically make the reader experience that kind of violence. This is a deconstruction and a critique of the personal toll that this sort of abuse takes, not only on the abused people, but on the abuser and the people who sit there and watch and do nothing. So again, it's just a really well thought out component of the story. The gender violence, the violence in general, the sexual violence, and the sort of oppression. And so I just think, again, this flies in the face of the critique that we read on this Twitter thread and shows that, George is, you can't critique the evils of society without coming from a place of believing in good and evil, I guess is what I'm saying.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And, he lays that out for us at every turn, that there's a right situation and a wrong situation, and that it doesn't, that doesn't determine anything in the long run about your longevity or anything like that. You could die at any time for good or bad.
And then just to sort of bring around back to the question of cycles of violence and grace, redemption arcs and stuff like that, breaking these cycles of violence is inherently part of this conversation when we talk about the ways in which things are passed on, legacy, good and bad. Like, and some of that is a matter of breaking the cycles of violence. That has to do with the reconciliation part of, like, letting the wildlings back into Westeros, tearing down the institution of the Unsullied, and eventually you will see Meereen find footing. I think that part of that will be Dany coming back to Meereen with the wise women of the Dosh Khaleen, and that they will help bring peace to the city. But there will be an answer. Like, Meereen's just not going to be broken until Dany leaves. And then, oh, well, the lesson was, don't try to liberate something because it just ends up worse. Like, this is a moment that Dany's experiencing where after a rebellion, there is a power vacuum. There is violence that gets done. George wants to be realistic. It's like, oh, they didn't all just eat ice cream. No, there was violence has been enacted, and there is a war of attrition, and there's vengeance that people want to enact. So, George gives us Dany listening to these stories of the sack where it starts to get blurry who's in the wrong. It's easy, like the first couple are easy. It's like, oh, well, the crappy slaver wants to get all the money from the weavers that he trained. And Dany's like, fuck you, no. And you owe them looms and compensation for their time and all this and that. But then there's another one where the slaves came and stole and raped and killed the family of the slave lord or whatever. But then it's like, well, these, maybe more innocent women that are being victims, and the retribution, I don't remember exactly, but the retribution that the former slaves had enacted was pretty awful. And so Dany's left to adjudicate, and she's like, well, I did make a rule, no raping, so these people have to be gelded now, but they do get to keep this. And again, I don't remember exactly how she does it, but the point is, George is showing us the messiness of replacing a power structure. but it's not the end of the story there. Like there will be an answer, and like when systems of power are toppled, eventually there is a new system that takes its place. It's just the transition period is something that has to be reckoned with, and that's what we see.
Right. Yeah, and it's the one thing that he doesn't model though is, and I think this is set out as a warning, he doesn't have a model for a perfect society. He tells us about, these places like the Great Empire of the Dawn and, Yi and A Shy by the Shadow, and they're all like bad places, but there's no framework in his books for a 100% good top to bottom system of government or system of control. And I think that's important. That's something that people need to realize.
Oh, I was talking when I was muted. I was just saying, because it doesn't exist in the real world. Like if George knew what that system was, then he would be a political scientist, like trying to, I don't know, like.
Exactly. No, but I mean, there's plenty of fictional books that include some perfect society or even a time when things were good. George doesn't even give us that. He doesn't say that, at one time this was so just, everybody wanted to be here. He says these places were, ancient hubs of the world, or, the King's Landing grew quickly, but he wasn't saying that they did things necessarily the best, or that it was the fairest, or that it was just there. He's not, the power structures in George's world are corrupt off the bat, but they all have that thing in common where they did try. They all started from some moral place. Like Nymeria.
The thing about governance though is that, like, it's only as good as the people involved, right?
Exactly,
the people voting or the people rolling, and people are inherently imperfect. So I think that's kind of what we're seeing here. But
yeah,
this has been a good discussion. I think we're at a pretty good place to wrap it up here. So
yeah, man.
Sorry we didn't get into any of the Daniel stuff another time.
No, it's okay. I mean, like getting thrown to lions, being in the pit with the vipers and everything like that. It's all. I think it's crazy how you could open up the Bible and go, "Whoa, this is from A Song of Ice and Fire." Well, this is from A Song of Ice and Fire. This is definitely, shadows dancing on the walls, like people in the fire not being burned. That is like, I don't know how you could read the Bible and then come back and read, A Song of Ice and Fire and go, man, these two are not connected in any way. They really, really are.
Yeah, you could definitely do more than one live stream on some of the biblical parallels
all day.
Maybe we'll do that sometime. So real quick, I did want to thank a couple more super chats that came in. Michael James sent one with no comments, so thanks, Michael. Patrick Long, I'm not sure if I thanked him. I don't think so. He said, what about Jaharis? That was a ways back, though. I forget what we were talking about at the time. We did talk about Jaharis a bit, though. So hopefully we covered.
Just that he's an archetype for a perfect ruler, but, like, we have the stories of perfect archetypes, but we don't know more than what is told to us about who these people are. That could have been the point we were trying to make.
I think Jaharis is coasting a lot on Alisanne's laurels there. I like how Fire and Blood gradually reeled that story out. It's like, oh wow, okay, Alisanne is really making things move here. So that's probably the best part of Fire and Blood, I would say, is Jaharis and Alisanne.
Yeah, and seeing the undercurrents beneath what we think is this, perfect film of history. But behind it is the, everything that went into making those shadows on the wall, right?
Totally. So there you go, guys. Thank you. Give Austin a round of applause.
Thank you guys so much,
man. Of it there, but yeah.
You guys are awesome. Thank you, LML. You guys are awesome. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Women of Ice and Fire, aka Salty Caps fan.
Yeah, I barely feel. Sorry, I barely feel confident speaking on air, let alone speaking about like the great things that George can do with his female characters. I feel like I just cannot underscore them enough. Like he is a fantastic writer in ways that I don't even understand. But yeah, he's breaking down tropes. He's not giving himself within that man, woman, male, female. He's not letting that bind him to any one theme or any one thing. It's awesome. But
in the end, the thing I'm going to argue in this Danny video, and that I've argued before, is that Daenerys is essentially the best fictional character that's been created perhaps ever, or certainly in recent memory. And by the time her story is done, I think that's really going to ring out. So I just can't wait for Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring After. Oh, that's another thing I wanted to mention. One of the things that gives away A Song of Ice and Fire being fundamentally hopeful is the fact that the last book is going to be called A Dream of Spring. Like,
right, yeah. I mean,
it's not going to end with a new long night. Like, and then the others won, the end, and everyone died.
Yeah, no, he can't, man. George is too. He's a good person in his heart and his soul. We keep seeing updates about his, his philanthropic and, adventures, and maybe not philanthropic, but he does care about, how people are. And, he has a movie theater, which is pretty, innocuous, but he gives back to his community, and he gives back to the writing community. You can see that he's about these things. He's about cooperation. So, cool. Thank you, Minty. Thank you so much.
There's Austin Flowers on Twitter. That's definitely where you can catch some of the Austin Flowers wisdom. So check that out. And I mentioned the cycle of the seasons, but again, I just want to underline the whole idea of A Dream of Spring. Like, the cycles are so important. So however the end of this story is achieved, it is a fundamentally hopeful story, simply for the fact that, like, we will find a way to overcome the long night and bring the spring again. And that literally represents life, regeneration. So there's really nothing more hopeful than that. So is it amoral or nihilistic? No, it certainly isn't. It's the opposite of that. It's just unafraid to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, if you will, because that's a part of finding the path to righteousness, to sort of co-opt biblical language here right at the end.
No, it's true. And, he gives us, he says, kill the boy and let the man be born. It's all about growth. And the characters he allows to grow, and when they grow, they are beautiful, like Jamie and, Brienne overcoming, we watched her overcome her stuff in the first couple minutes when she kicked the crap out of the guys that were, hitting on her and being mean to her. Like, when the characters can go through that, they're beautiful, man. And he allows the characters to go through that on their own, and it's so good, dude. So
good. It's at the end of the day, it's kind of sad that people would read the story and like think that it's some sort of depressing exercise in punishing the readers. Like, it's a fun joke to make about George killing your beloved characters or whatever, but like, so.
And actually, sorry, if I could, there was one thing that I wanted to bring up to you. It's in A Storm of Swords, I think, when Sansa is talking to Olenna Tyrell, the lady,
Queen of Thorns.
Queen of Thorns. Thank you. It's so subtle in that chapter. Olenna keeps calling. She's telling Sansa, "You should come back with me to Highgarden." It's like, it's along the same lines. Really old person telling really young person, like Aemon and Jon, or Barristan and Daenerys. And, Olenna's telling her, "You should come back to Highgarden and just chill for a bit. Just take it easy and just kind of like save up and reserve yourself." And Olenna keeps calling for wine and cheese, which are two things that get better with age. And George is just laying it out for us, like these themes of here's what you should do. Things like maidens, like cow's milk, get change and undergo change when they're kept encapsulated in another place, in somewhere safe, when they're undisturbed. And she's trying to tell Sansa, you know, hey, you take your time, think about what it is that you're trying to do. And all the while telling us, hey, wine and cheese and wine and cheese. And these things, these are only things that get better with time.
That's interesting. George does, like, I always point out how the sort of mythical symbolism enhances the heart and conflict in the course of the scene. But yeah, he's doing it all kinds of ways. That's a great example.
Cool, man. Well, hey, thank you so much. I'm sorry to drag it on.
No, it's cool. Rand, the chat loves it. So there you go.
Cool, man.
All right. Well, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thank
I'll have
you.
you back on sometime for sure. And
anytime.
Guys, I will see you on Sunday. I'm not sure. I've got a couple ideas about what I'm going to do, but there will be a Sunday stream at 3 Pacific, normal, or 3 East. No, 3 Pacific. Yeah, that's what it is. 6 Eastern. So normal Sunday time. I'll see you then. Take care.